The Sheriff contains graphic descriptions of violence, and in several episodes, sexual assault. It may not be suitable for all listeners. I'm Tony Adame, and this is The Sheriff, a new podcast series from the Northwest Florida Daily News and the Gannett Company. It can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you might download your podcast from.
The wheels of justice in Okaloosa County have a tendency to turn very slowly.
Here's a quick recap of what we've already gone over so far. On the first episode of The Sheriff, we went into the details of Okaloosa County Sheriff candidate Lester Wilson's murder on the night of March 15, 1940, in the living room of his own home. He was shot in the head with a double-barrel shotgun through his front door as his wife sat by the fireplace just feet away, and his 12-year-old son Ray was in the bedroom just adjacent to the living room. Ray would go on to become Okaloosa County Sheriff in 1956, the youngest in Florida history at just 28 years old, and he would eventually track down and put on trial several men who were accused of killing his father. That was in 1958. We went through Lester Wilson and his family's history in coming to Okaloosa County, their business successes in the northern part of the county, and then their frustration in trying to get a foothold in legitimate business in Crestview, the county seat. Mainly problems that had to do with the grip that Vice had on the county at the time in the form of bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution, and all done, seemingly, under the protection of a string of sheriffs in the county. Lester became chief of police in Crestview from 1929 to 1931. He ran unsuccessfully for sheriff in 1932 and 1936, losing to Johnny P. Steele both times, the second time in a surprise runoff. Shook by the prospect of almost losing, Steele, Constable Joe Adams, and a group of their friends from the community went about harassing and physically assaulting Lester Wilson till things came to a boil in the early morning hours of February 28, 1939, when the leader of the group of civilians, their friends, Murray MacArthur, and another man with a long history of violence, Charlie Powell, confronted Lester outside of a bar in Crestview, with Lester ultimately shooting both men and killing Murray. Lester pled not guilty to a charge of manslaughter, saying it was self-defense, and he was acquitted in one of the most sensational trials in county history at that time. And he announced almost immediately afterward that he was going to run for sheriff in 1940, where he was quickly becoming the odds-on favorite to win. It seemed, finally, like the people in Okaloosa County really wanted change. They were fed up with the vice that continued to plague their community. But Lester wouldn't make it to the election. On episode 2, we looked into the history of the MacArthurs, a family that had deep ties to the men who would eventually be tried for murdering Lester, and it also gave us some insight into the conspiracy of silence that kept Lester's killers free for almost 20 years. We went into the night of the murder, March 15, 1940, getting into the specifics, starting with kind of a circle that extended out from the house at 748 Long Drive where the Wilsons lived, and where the murder took place. This included a witness who saw Constable Joe Adams' car driving away from the scene just minutes after the murder. Ironic, considering that no Okaloosa County law enforcement would show up until at least 2 or 3 hours later. And the man the state sent to investigate, Prosecutor E. Dixie Beggs, was the same man who had tried to convict Lester Wilson of murder the year before and been defeated in court, with Lester serving as his own defense counsel. After the murder, Beggs convened a grand jury in Crestview that led to no arrests in 1940. It was a sham investigation, as we will soon find out, and through fear and intimidation, the circle of people who had key information in the murder were silenced one way or another. There was another grand jury in 1952, this time led by Alty MacArthur, who was then sheriff, and nothing came of it either. It was right around the same time that the second grand jury convened that Ray Wilson, 24 years old now, moved back to Crestview from Port St. Joe, Florida, spurred on by his new wife, Virginia. Ray had served in the U.S. Navy as a military police in Korea in the 7th Infantry, right in the preamble to the Korean War. What the people of Crestview didn't know at the time, and what Lester's enemies definitely didn't know, was that Ray's return to Crestview was part of a long simmering plot for justice for Lester. The ultimate goal of the plan? To have Ray become sheriff in 1956. Few people knew about this plan, and for good reason. Ray obviously knew about it. His brother Woodrow, his uncle Fox, and now his wife Virginia. And there was a good reason they didn't want anyone to know. They knew how dangerous it was. They knew that if people knew that Ray was going to come back and run for sheriff, his life would be in danger. And so would the lives of the people in his family, including his mother, Bama, who still lived in town. And soon, Ray and Virginia's firstborn son, Stuart, who we've heard from several times in this podcast and we'll hear from again soon. This was a group that never gave up on finding out the truth about Lester Wilson's murder. And they were determined that the only way they could do that was to get one of their own in as sheriff. The road to which would be just as dangerous and full of pitfalls as anything that had come before. And, like in any good story, they were going to need some help along the way. This is The Sheriff, Episode 3, Electra A. Wilson. You're listening to The Sheriff, a new podcast series from the Northwest Florida Daily News and the Gannett Company. It can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you might download your podcasts from. Fox Wilson, Lester Wilson's younger brother, ran for sheriff in 1940, right after Lester's murder. He lost by approximately 1,000 votes to the old party candidate, H.I. Enzer, one of the brothers in the powerful Enzer family, which included Dr. Owen Enzer and Dr. Judd Enzer. They founded the Enzer Brothers Hospital in Crestview in 1926. It was the only medical facility in the county at the time. Fox became constable in the late 1940s in Okaloosa County, almost with the sole purpose of investigating Lester's murder. He didn't get much of a chance to, however. He was taken out of office by Governor Fuller Warren in 1950, alongside H. Al Enzer, who'd been sheriff for a decade, for not enforcing gambling laws in the county. The action against Fox, in retrospect, seemed pretty punitive on Warren's part, but also easy to understand. For years, Fox had been a thorn in Warren's side. He'd publicly accused him in the press of not even attempting to solve Lester's murder, writing letters and calling him on almost a weekly basis, until Warren said the case was unsolvable and ultimately shut Fox up by stripping him of his title. H. Al Enzer, who would have had to run against Lester Wilson in the 1940 sheriff's election, as an underdog actually, was replaced first by Farron Campbell, a local attorney who Warren took out of office several months later when he realized that Campbell was Enzer's son-in-law. He replaced Campbell with Alty MacArthur, a well-respected engineer for the State Roads Department. Enzer would be back in office in 1952, defeating MacArthur, who went against his party and ran on a ballot of cleaning up the county of vice, essentially turning his back on the old guard who had been able to elect every candidate they'd run since the county was founded in 1915. Elections in Okaloosa County usually just went one way. That is, whoever won the Democratic primary in the spring usually ended up being the one that won the election. That's because almost everyone was a Democrat. So in this case, Alty ran against H. Al Enzer in the primary. They're both Democrats, but H. Al Enzer had the backing of the old guard, the people that had all the money in the county, obviously his brothers, and obviously the interests of their hospital, which was a huge moneymaker and something that people in the county really needed, a service that they relied on. He didn't really want to go against that. Think about this. If you're going to go against the Enzers in some sort of election, you have to worry how it's going to affect you. Are you going to be able to get the same care at the hospital as you would? Are you going to be able to go to the Enzers and feel like you're going to get the good medical attention that you need? What if your wife gets pregnant? What if your kids get sick? It's not something that people really wanted to go against. And so for Alty MacArthur to go against his own party, to go against that old guard, meant a lot. It meant that he was pretty brave and was willing to put himself out there, in this case at least. And you can tell by reading a lot of the articles that came out in 1952 that Alty had a lot of support. A lot of church leagues backed him. A lot of veterans leagues backed him. And the thing they pointed to was that in 1952, that summer, it was projected to hit an all-time high for tourism money in Okaloosa County. It's because Alty was cleaning up the beach area in Fort Walton Beach and Destin, where a lot of the vice was happening at. But it really wasn't to be for Alty. H. Al Enzer had a lot of powerful people behind him, and he defeated him pretty easily in the election. And it was something that kind of came as a bit of a relief to Alty's family, actually. In the last episode, we talked with Penny Janowski, Alty's daughter. She remembers that time pretty vividly when her dad lost that election.
The governor called him and asked him if he would take over as sheriff after they kicked Enzer out of office. Mm-hmm. Because Enzer would not do anything about the gambling on Santa Rosa Island. Mm-hmm. My dad agreed to do it. And he did it for about a year and a half. When it came election time, he ran against Enzer, and Enzer won. And I tell you, I hugged my dad's neck, and I said, I'm so glad. Everybody was sorry he lost, not me. I'm about 13 years old, and I said, I'm so glad you lost. He said, well, why are you glad I lost? I said, because I'm afraid somebody will come and shoot you. That's what a kid would think when your dad is the sheriff.
I can see why you would think that.
You're right.
It's been a lot of history of that actually happening.
Yeah.
Did he seem relieved? Did he seem like he was pretty? Did he just move on with his life and then didn't?
Oh gosh, yes, he did not. I don't think that he even expected to win.
It's easy for us to understand how Penny felt, especially because we know what happened to the Wilsons after Lester was murdered trying to become sheriff in 1940. Ray Wilson had actually been around Penny's age when Alty lost the election when his father was going to run for sheriff in 1940. And whatever brief fleeting hope for justice that he'd had that night of his father's murder was squashed out within hours. That was when Ray, who was 12 years old, had experienced in a span of 6 hours, his father having his head blown off in his living room, followed by the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office not showing up to the scene of the crime for 2 or 3 hours. Somehow, while everyone else in town and the neighborhood seemed to make it there. And then, later that night, as he picked his father's brain matter and skull fragments out of his feet, listening to 2 officers standing outside his bedroom window, unbeknownst to them, and telling each other that there was no way they'd ever catch who killed Lester. You're listening to The Sheriff, a new podcast series from the Northwest Florida Daily News and the Gannett Company. That night, Ray experienced the kind of intense childhood trauma that we hear about sometimes in books and movies and documentaries. It didn't just change Ray's mind, it totally rewired everything about him. He went from relative safety and the life that he knew to a whole nother reality where he was going to spend the rest of his life kind of on guard. In some cases, this kind of trauma can create some pretty bad individuals. I'm talking about criminals, people that spend their life putting other people in danger. Ray ended up being kind of the opposite. Now, he was a dangerous guy, don't get me wrong, but he was dangerous to the criminals. He was dangerous from that point on to people that wanted to do the wrong thing. So while the sham of an investigation put on by the sheriff's office in the state came and went with no arrests, Ray and his uncle Fox and his older brother Woodrow continued to search for the killers. They chased leads all over the county and all over the region when they could. They did this for 6 years until Ray graduated from Crestview High and joined the Navy. The notebooks they filled up with interviews and clues pointing the two of them in what they thought was the general direction of the killers. Ray was part of the 7th Infantry in Korea, the military police, which was no coincidence. Long before he'd left Crestview, he and his uncle had formed the plan we talked about on how they'd finally get justice for Lester's murder, one way or the other. Fox had kind of been the front line, the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, running for and losing that sheriff's election in 1940 we talked about, and then winning that spot as constable. He was the front-facing part of the Wilson family after Lester died, and he was open and vocal about finding justice for his brother, and being a thorn in the side of the powers that be in the old guard in the county for at least a decade, keeping the Wilson name on the ballots and in the mind of residents in the county until Ray's anticipated return. When Ray and Virginia returned home, he went to work for a local dry cleaning business. It ended up serving as sort of an apprenticeship because Ray would eventually open his own dry cleaning business within several years, a really successful one at that too. Good enough that it would end up funding his run for sheriff when he sold it to some men in Alabama. And this was when we learned that Ray could really stick to the plan. Outwardly facing when people would ask him about his father inevitably, and ask him if he was still angry about what happened, Ray would just say that he put it in the past, that he hadn't been angry for a long time. Reality was much different. Nothing made Ray's blood boil like when he saw Johnny P. Steele, the former sheriff who his father had narrowly lost to in the 1936 election. Steele's constable, Joe Adams, drew much of the same feeling from Ray, as did the MacArthurs and the Kaysons and the Powells and the Enzers. Like a lot of people that go through that kind of trauma, Ray developed a lot of mechanisms to combat it and make sure that people didn't see right into his soul right when they saw him. One of those became a pretty famous signature phrase that he had around town. Whenever he sees someone, he would say, "Hello, neighbor," or "Hey, neighbor." Kind of a friendly Mr. Rogers-esque term to greet people. It's what he really became known for. Ray thought, over time, that the men that he suspected of his father's murder had to know how he really felt. He'd see them and he would smile and they would smile back. And in Ray's mind, he thought they know. They know that I know. That no one could keep up the mask he had for that long and not give it away. Ray was wrong. They never had a clue. For my money, the best movie of all time is probably The Godfather Part 2. My favorite part of the movie is when they're portraying young Don Vito Corleone, played by Marlon Brando in the original Godfather, and in part 2 he's played by Robert De Niro. And we get to see how Don Vito became the Godfather in the first place.
Hai Vito, ma tu sei sicuro che hai 12 sì?
Non scandare. I make an offer, you don't refuse. Don't worry.
One thing that I always loved about the character of Vito Corleone was that people continually underestimated him throughout his life. I see a lot of the same qualities in Vito Corleone as I do in Ray Wilson. Think about it. Both of their experiences were essentially formed by childhood trauma. Vito seeing the murder of his father and his older brother, and both of them were underestimated their entire lives by their enemies until it was too late for their enemies to realize what exactly they'd underestimated. And, just like in The Godfather, the enemies of Ray Wilson had underestimated him at their own peril, and it would be their ultimate undoing. It shouldn't have come as much of a surprise that Ray was as good a businessman as he was. He went from an apprentice at a dry cleaning business in Crestview to owning his own business within several years. And he was successful enough that sometime in 1955, he was able to broker the sale of that business to some guys from Alabama. That money that he made out of that, I believe it was around $4,000 or $5,000, was what he would use to fund his sheriff's campaign. And not that all that money went to the campaign, but you got to consider that he had to get enough money out of it to still pay all his bills and run a campaign for about 6 months, where all he did was focus on winning the sheriff's election. And he really couldn't have picked a better time to run. What Ray found out when he entered the 1956 sheriff's election was that apathy in Okaloosa County was kind of at an all-time high. People didn't expect much out of the office of sheriff at that time, and it's hard to blame them. Since the position had been instituted in the county in 1915, they'd seen a series of sheriffs, all coming from the same party, all coming from the same backing, all with kind of the same bend. They were going to allow vice and just kind of look the other way when that stuff happened. So they really weren't there for the citizens of the county. They were there for the people that had money. They weren't there for the average guy. They weren't there for the average citizen or the average family. And if you wanted to know why people didn't challenge the sheriff's office or challenge the old guard in Okaloosa County, you didn't have to look back but 16 years. Point at the murder of Lester Wilson and say, that's what happens when people challenge this party. That's what happens when people challenge the sheriff. You can end up dead. Ray ran his first ad in the Okaloosa News-Journal in April. It was the same ad he would run throughout the campaign and all over town. It's a big picture of Ray on the left, and the campaign ad read as such: "Elect for you, Sheriff of Okaloosa County, Ray Wilson, a Crestview businessman with no ties to any political factions and a platform of justice for all. If elected, I plan to attend one of the nation's best police schools to better qualify as your sheriff. The son of the late Lester Wilson, Crestview Chief of Police for many years, and a veteran who served with the security guard of the Russian-American Commission in Korea. If you want law enforcement that can hold the respect of all the people, vote for and elect Ray Wilson, Sheriff of Okaloosa County." H.L. Enzer opened the 1956 Okaloosa County Sheriff's election as the odds-on favorite to win his fifth term. But by the May primary, Ray had clawed his way above the pack of other candidates and was second to Enzer, who saw his lead fading quickly. By the second primary, on May 29, 1956, Ray was closing in, and he knew it. In the days leading up to that May 29th primary, Ray took out an ad in the Okaloosa News-Journal. In this ad, he managed to take kind of a sideways shot at the MacArthurs. Here's what the ad read: "Words cannot express my deep gratitude to the people for their wonderful vote given me on May 8th. This is the first time in 16 years my opponent has had any serious opposition for this office. I have not and will not resort to any so-called smear campaign against any man. I want to be elected on my own merits. My platform has not changed. I will give you the best possible service in your sheriff's department. You will hear rumors about me. I ask that you consider them, weigh them, and if you cannot decide, please call me. Considering the count, I am the leading candidate for the office of sheriff. I sincerely want to ask the people who did not see fit to vote for me in the first primary for their active support on May 29th. When Ray talks about having heard rumors about him, there was kind of a main rumor and then a secondary rumor. And the main rumor was pretty easy to clear up. That was that his opponent said that the only reason that Ray was running for sheriff was to avenge his father's murder. which would be a fair criticism because you don't want some vigilante to be the sheriff. Ray's response whenever he was asked this would be to say, I think I can do a good job. I've got experience and I could be good at this. The other rumor about Ray was a lot more hurtful, and I can't really say how he dealt with it in public or private, but I do know what the rumor was, and it was that Lester Wilson had killed Murray MacArthur over Bama Wilson, and possibly her relationship with another man. What that exactly would have to do with Ray running for sheriff, I can't tell you, but I do know that that was one of the stories that was out there, and I'm sure it was very hurtful for Ray and his family to have heard that. On the night of Tuesday, May 29, 1956, Ray Wilson was declared the winner in the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office election. He'd won by a landslide, carrying 32 out of 35 precincts that reported, and almost doubling the votes of H. Al Enzer, the incumbent. At 28 years old, Ray Wilson had become the youngest elected sheriff in Florida history. Stunned and shaken by his loss, Enzer was to serve out his term and hand the keys over to Ray in January of 1957. Enzer would be dead within 2 weeks. You're listening to The Sheriff, a new podcast series from the Northwest Florida Daily News and the Gannett Company. Enzer's public comments rarely rose above the most mundane. After he won re-election in 1952, defeating incumbent Altie MacArthur, he did give what I thought was a pretty interesting quote to the Pensacola News Journal. Enzer said, quote, "I'm not here to serve outsiders." And I think that pretty well sums up his entire tenure as sheriff. He was there to serve a very insular group of people. And I think now it's fair to say that group didn't include the Wilsons, or anyone that was friends with the Wilsons, or anyone that might look a little deeper into the murder of Lester Wilson. That's who the outsiders were. Now, it would be one of the outsiders taking over as sheriff of Okaloosa County, the spot that Enzer had held for most of the last 2 decades. It was no secret that Enzer had battled failing health over the last few years of his tenure as sheriff. On June 22, 1956, less than 1 month after his loss to Ray Wilson in the election for Okaloosa County Sheriff, H. Al Enzer died of a massive heart attack. In the hours after his death, Enzer's inner circle worked quickly to try to use an obscure law to put his wife, Florence, into his office as sheriff of Okaloosa County. Florida Governor Leroy Collins stepped in, called Ray to Tallahassee immediately, and placed him in office 6 months early in order to finish out Enzer's final term. Ray officially became Okaloosa County Sheriff on July 3, 1956. In one of the campaign ads I read that Ray ran in the paper, he mentioned going to police school if he were elected sheriff. Police school is underselling what Ray was talking about quite a bit. What he was doing was going back and forth to the national offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, taking training courses on their latest crime-solving techniques, and, in workshops, going over ways with FBI agents that he could possibly solve his father's murder. As you can imagine, they were more than willing to lend their expertise. The Playground Daily News, now the Northwest Florida Daily News, where I work, ran a cover story on Ray in November 1956. I believe it was his first in-depth interview since he became sheriff. Now in the seat of power in Okaloosa County, and not even 30 years old, Ray's tone on his father's murder was beginning to change for the first time. In public, at least. The article stated that Ray, in fact, was spending every moment not on duty as sheriff, quote, poring over clues in Lester's murder. Poring over clues is one way to put it. From what I've been told, Ray spent most of that time talking to people face to face. So, if poring over clues means sweating people in interviews, then that's what Ray was doing. And we have to kind of get into the mindset of the people, not just in Okaloosa County, but in all parts of Northwest Florida at the time, and law enforcement across Florida. The thought that Lester Wilson's murder could be solved was pretty far-fetched. And that came from a lot of stuff. It came from 2 grand juries, and it came from a governor in Fuller Warren saying several times that the case was unsolvable. When asked in the article what he thought his chances were of actually finding his father's killers, Ray said, quote, "Most people told me I was foolish for running for sheriff and that I should be worried about the consequences of running and losing the election. But I had enough confidence in myself that I didn't care about the consequences. So when you ask what I think the chances are that I solved my father's murder, I'd say I'm as sure about that as I was about my chances of becoming sheriff." What Ray didn't tell the reporter that day was that the investigation into his father's murder had already begun to bear fruit. In Ray's mind, the investigation into his father's murder on March 15, 1940, never really stopped. But it officially reopened on July 3, 1956. That was the day that Ray was sworn in as sheriff of Okaloosa County. Not that anyone in Okaloosa County besides Ray was going to have much to do with the investigation. To help solve his father's murder, Ray would turn to a fellow outsider. You don't really have to be an expert on criminal law to know that lie detector tests aren't really looked at as a viable way to help solve cases anymore. You probably just have to have watched an episode of CSI or Law & Order in the last 20 years. Back in the 1950s, however, things were much different. You can look at the 1950s as kind of the heyday for lie detector tests. Back then, they were really looked at as something that could determine someone's guilt or innocence. And they definitely were admissible in court, and they definitely were something that people turned to try to solve really complicated cases, actually. By the early 1950s, there were only 9 people certified across the entire United States to administer lie detector tests. One of those men was Walter Steinsick, an investigator for the Pensacola Police Department. Steinsick grew up in Van Buren, Arkansas, and did 10 years in the Navy before joining the Pensacola Police Department in 1949. That's where he quickly carved out his own unique lane in police investigations, not just for his department, but for all of the United States. In 1955, Steinsick was put in charge of a case that would put him on the radar of almost every law enforcement agency in the country. That was after a 7-year-old Pensacola girl was brought to a local emergency room at a hospital. Her family said she'd been raped walking home from the grocery store. The injuries to the girl were so bad that she almost hemorrhaged to death from the bleeding. Steinsick moved quickly and began to round up sexual predators he knew that lived in the Pensacola area. He administered lie detector tests, and after several days, had 0 leads. Steinsick went back to the hospital to check on the girl and talk to the family. At that time, one of the doctors who'd operated on the girl asked to speak with Steinsick in private. That's when he told Steinsick that he'd heard the family's story to the police, that the girl had been sexually assaulted on the way home from the grocery store, then walked home after the sexual assault. The doctor explained to Steinsick how someone who had sustained those type of injuries in a sexual assault could not have walked home afterward, much less walked anywhere at all. Steinsick brought the family back down to the police department for questioning. When he got the girl's father on the lie detector test, the man cracked. He admitted to not only raping his daughter, but to several unsolved rapes in the Pensacola area of other young girls. After solving that case, Steinsick's reputation continued to grow. After a while, it seemed like he had his pick of law enforcement agencies to work for across the country. New York, California, South Florida. He didn't want any of them. He wanted to stay in Pensacola, but he also wanted some freedom as far as his job went. Steinsick wanted to be able to pick his own cases and, in some cases, go on loan to other departments, especially in the state of Florida where he thought he could do some real good. One of those cases was actually at the heart of an international incident in 1961 that made its way all the way back to the White House. That was when Steinsick and Escambia County Sheriff Bill Davis tracked a murder suspect all the way to Acapulco, Mexico after he fled from Pensacola. Steinsick and Davis thought the man was innocent. They administered a lie detector test that proved that, and to show his thanks, the man turned them into the Mexican authorities, telling the federales that Steinsick and Davis were working for Fidel Castro as double agents and trying to run guns through Mexico. Steinsick and Davis were taken into custody immediately by the federales, questioned, then charged with violating the sovereignty of Mexico. An emergency phone call was placed to the U.S. State Department, who confirmed that the men were actually law enforcement officers from Pensacola. Steinsick and Davis were immediately deported to Miami on a 2 a.m. flight. The incident made its way, of course, back to Mexican President Adolfo López Mateos, who took his concerns to U.S. President John F. Kennedy.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
Kennedy, in turn, called Florida Governor Ferris Bryant and ordered an immediate investigation into Steinsick and Davis's actions in Mexico. The two were eventually cleared of all wrongdoing, at home and abroad.
I'm working on a podcast about a old murder from 1940 that was solved in 1958. And
okay, was that the Ray Wilson?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, buddy,
exactly.
hey, I know all about that.
That's Walter Steinsick's son, Walter Steinsick III. He was a longtime firefighter in Pensacola, actually. I was able to talk with Walter III and his sister Walda about Walter Steinsick, their father, and it really reminded me a lot of the time I spent talking with Stuart Wilson, Ray Wilson's son and Lester Wilson's grandson. They have a lot of great memories of their dad, and it actually gave me some insight into, what kind of a person he was, which was what this is really all about, trying to figure out not only the mystery of Lester Wilson's murder, but finding out who the people were on both sides of the case. Just like in the last episode where we went into a lot of the MacArthur's background, I think it's important to know a lot about Ray and Lester and Stuart and Also to know about Walter Steinsick, who arguably was, one of the 2 or 3 most important people that went towards solving this case. One interesting thing I found out from talking to Walter III and from Walda is that Walter Steinsick started off as a crime scene photographer for the Pensacola Police Department. And from there, that's how he worked his way up to investigator. It turned out there were several times that Walter went out to take photos of a crime scene. The people out there were stumped, and Walter helped solve the case.
I remember as a kid, he used to take me on all these murder scenes, and he would photograph bodies and stuff like that, and took me down to Port of Pensacola once, and they pulled a guy out of the water, and the guy was so swollen up, all his skin was, snow white. Mm-hmm. So my dad put on rubber gloves and took the guy's hand and pulled the skin off his fingers and put on his own fingers that had the rubber gloves on, and then that's how he got the prints to identify who the guy was. And
whoa, you saw that happen? Jeez.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was 19 years old.
I think it's worth mentioning right now, but parenting was a lot different in the 1940s and 1950s than it is today. A whole nother universe, pretty much. That being said, there are some qualities that Walter Steinsick had that I think really drew Ray to him, and not just the part about, being a really good investigator, which he was. He was obviously one of the best in the entire country at investigating crimes. I think there were other qualities that he had that really matched up with Ray and how Ray was and what kind of a person he was at the time. Walter did a really good job of putting that into words for me.
I mean, he was a really good dad. And things were black and white with him. I mean, he was very honest, and if you did what was right, he was going to do everything he could to prove that. But if you were the bad guy, he would do whatever, he would try to find whatever information he needed to get a conviction.
So I think what we've established about Walter Steinsick is that he was a great investigator, a really great investigator, and that in him, Ray Wilson had kind of found that kindred spirit. And when he approached Walter to help solve his father's murder, Walter was in. You're listening to The Sheriff, a new podcast series from the Northwest Florida Daily News and the Gannett Company. The way that Ray and Walter approached the investigation was really fascinating to me, in that I don't think I've ever quite heard of a case quite like it, in that you have 2 local law enforcement officers from separate parts of a region. So Walter's Pensacola Police Department, and Ray is obviously the Okaloosa County Sheriff. And that's not really a great match. Those 2 wouldn't be working together under any sort of other circumstances except for this one really unique case. And because of Walter's reputation, where he could go work for other departments for an extended period of time, he'd be on loan to Ray for about 2 years, actually, in this case. In Okaloosa County, where the investigation was, for all intents and purposes, centrally located, Ray was the #1 law enforcement officer. He didn't have to answer to anyone. In the state of Florida, he really just had to answer to the governor in this case. And the governor was aware, because of Ray's contact with the FBI, of what he was doing. So not many people knew that Ray and Walter Steinsick were working together. And they were working on levels of secrecy that we usually only see in the federal government. And they were going by a lot of those federal government investigation rules. These guys could cross state borders if they wanted to and not have to ask when they went into Texas or Georgia or Alabama. And the only really deal that they'd cut was with the governor, with Leroy Collins. And in that case, Ray had promised, and this was actually Ray's idea, was that if they did come to the point where they were going to need to go to a judge to get an arrest warrant, he was going to go to the governor first and tell him what they were going to do, then go to the judge, and then the next step was they were going to go to the Panama City Beach Police Department, which was, about an hour away. And they were going to have the Panama City Beach Police come to Crestview or Fort Walton Beach or Laurel Hill or wherever the suspects were, and they were going to be the ones that executed the warrant and brought him in. In that case, they would make sure that the suspects, if there were any, would not ever be in the Crestview jail or would not ever be in anywhere that Ray directly oversaw, which I thought was really smart. So that was a team. It was Ray and Walter Steinsick that were going to try to solve this case. It's a pretty formidable duo. The first thing they had to do was teach Walter about the case. They had to go over every single aspect of it. And now, unlike in the past, they had access to a lot more stuff. Ray had all his notebooks, and he had almost 20 years of knowledge about the case in his head. but he took the time to relearn it with Walter, where they both kind of treated it like they didn't know exactly what was going on, which was really kind of a cool way to approach it. Ray didn't necessarily wipe away that knowledge, he couldn't, but he went from Walter's point of view. So he's reinvestigating from Walter's point of view with Walter, and if Walter had a specific question to ask him, Ray could answer it, but otherwise they kind of went from that point of view, and it ended up being really effective. It took a little while, though. The first 6 months, they estimated that they traveled about 9,000 miles by car together, all over the South, all over Florida, and they talked to dozens of people about the case. And they really didn't come away with much that Ray didn't already have, or that wasn't already in the files. Then, they heard a rumor about a girl who used to live in Crestview.
They were generally poverty-stricken, always plebeian and obscure, working with unsuccessful diligence at handicrafts, laboring on the wharves, or following the sea as sailors before the mast, living here and there about the town in hired tenements, and coming finally to the almshouse as the natural home of their old age. At last, after creeping, as it were, for such a length of time along the utmost verge of the opaque puddle of obscurity, they had taken that downright plunge which, sooner or later, is the destiny of all families, whether princely or plebeian. Nathaniel Hawthorne, House of the Seven Gables, 1871.
When Ray Wilson and Walter Steinsick really started to dig into their investigation, there were a couple names that kept popping up. And two of those were Jesse Kayson and Doyle Kayson. Now, we've talked about the Kaysons here and there over the podcast so far, but just to give a quick recap, Jesse Kayson and Doyle Kayson were two guys who grew up in Crestview, somewhat, back and forth, and were really good friends with all of the parties involved. Murray MacArthur was one of their closest friends, as was his older brother, Altie MacArthur. These were relationships that played out over decades, where these people spent a lot of time together, they had a lot in common, and they had a lot of common interests. And I think it's important to look at the Kaysons as a family who, you know, outside of the Wilsons, I think were one of the more interesting parts of this whole story. And while the crime part is very fascinating, I think telling the story of the families and trying to see this sort of, you know, like Hawthorne said, this rise and fall where you try to make things better and sometimes things get worse, and through sometimes, no matter how hard you work, things go bad. And sometimes you get lucky, and for a generation or two, you're on top. And I think the Kaysons are a good example of how that works in America, not just in Okaloosa County, but everywhere. Jesse James Kayson Sr. was a World War I veteran who came home and went to work for L&N Railroad. He was married to Katie Jean, and they had 4 children. Jesse, the oldest, was born in 1902, followed by their only girl, Gertrude, in 1904, younger brother Doyle in 1907, and the youngest boy, Raymond, born in 1910. The family moved around quite a bit because of the railroad work, but it was mostly centered around the Alabama-Florida border. Jesse Sr. was from Blountstown, Florida, which is about an hour and a half east of Crestview in Okaloosa County. But when he retired from the railroad in 1928, he moved permanently to Crestview, somewhere where he'd visited quite a bit already. And when he moved there, the entire family moved with him. So obviously, Raymond would have been a senior in high school. Gertrude was already ready to get married. She married a guy from Crestview and became Gertrude Sullivan. And Jesse and Doyle were getting into their early, mid-20s, still that kind of age even now where you could be living with your parents still, or you could not, but you haven't totally found your footing yet most of the time. You're still kind of trying to figure out who you are and what you're going to do. In some cases, some people figure out it earlier, but whatever happened, the entire family moved to Crestview at that time. And it was that move, a lot like the Wilsons did around the same time when they came to Crestview, was the same time the Kaysons came to Crestview. And the Kaysons came there just for the same reason as the Wilsons. They wanted a better life. And that move would kind of ultimately determine the trajectory of the family over the next couple decades. Each of the 3 boys had very distinct personalities. Jesse, as the oldest, was really the leader. He was charismatic, and he was a talker. He could kind of talk his way in anywhere, any social circle, any sort of party or anything like that. Raymond was a lot more like Jesse. He was someone who, was outgoing. And being the youngest, he always, sometimes the youngest kid has a pretty, interesting personality. They're more outgoing than the than the other kids. Doyle was the quiet one. He wasn't a talker like Jesse. He wasn't outgoing like Raymond. He was very quiet, and he kind of kept to himself. The Kaysons weren't in Crestview for very long before Lester Wilson was named chief of police. And that's about the time that the family started to run into some problems, some legal difficulties. Mainly, Doyle was arrested several times. I found in public records at least 4 arrests for reckless driving in and around the area of Crestview, including up around the Alabama border. And Raymond actually got in a lot of trouble. In May of 1930, he was sentenced to jail for several months and fined $100 for bootlegging. He actually ended up in the front page of the Pensacola Journal in November of 1930. So when he was arrested for stealing a car, but he actually had a pretty good alibi. He was already in jail on the bootlegging charge in May when the car had been stolen. Now what Raymond had done is bought the car stolen from someone else, who he said had official paperwork. Now, Raymond, pretty honorably went and fought in World War II like a lot of guys in his generation. And when he came home, he had a much different bend on life. He wanted to be respectable. In 1948, Raymond Kayson ran for constable of the 3rd District of Okaloosa County, and he lost to Fox Wilson. It wasn't long before he was actually back in the public sector, though, because pretty quickly after that, no doubt thanks to his connection to the MacArthurs, he was named an assistant highway director for the roads department. And looking at that over the rest of his life, that's kind of where he ran into a lot of trouble. In 1957, on the front page of the Panama City News Herald, there's an article. It says, Assistant Highway Director arrested for drunken driving in Panama City. The article stated that Raymond, who was in charge of 16 different counties on the highway system, had been arrested around midnight on a Monday night for drunken driving. And it was drunken driving that would ultimately end Raymond's career in the State Roads Department. In 1959, he got arrested in Panama City again, this time in actually a state-owned vehicle. He flipped it several times, destroyed the vehicle, and was fired ultimately because the cop said that he could smell alcohol on Raymond, even though Raymond denied drinking. And obviously they didn't have breathalyzers back then, and I don't even know if they had DUI tests. But whatever it was, he denied that he'd been drinking. The people that worked at the State Department said it was still irresponsible use of a vehicle, and he got fired. That was on the front page too. There's not much information on Doyle throughout this time. We know by his own admission that he was arrested by Lester Wilson several times for drunken disorderly conduct in Crestview, and that he'd had a lot of problems with Lester when he was the chief of police. I was able to confirm that he was married at least 5 times, and I know that from other accounts and other people that talked about Doyle back then, that he was really known around town as somebody who was kind of a do-nothing. He spent most of his time at the bars at Juke Hill, that we talked about in the first episode, the kind of the bar district in Crestview. I know he was downtown a lot, and I know that he kind of followed Jesse around a lot. And to say he was kind of like a gopher for Jesse is more of a compliment to Doyle than anything, because other than helping Jesse out in his life and whatever he was doing, Doyle wasn't doing a whole lot. And what we also know is that Doyle somehow was tied to the assassination of Lester Wilson. And we know that because of Venie Davis's testimony. Venie, who was a Wilson's neighbor, testified in open court in 1958 that the night of the murder of Lester Wilson, she'd encountered Doyle Kayson in the Wilsons' home later that night. Doyle had never been in the home before the day of the murder. And that night somehow he was helping clean up, he was around, he was talking to people, and at one point Venie told them that, she'd run out of her house, obviously run over to see Lester when she heard the gunshot, and she'd almost seen who was in the cars that were parked in front of her house. And it was Doyle who told her, maybe it was better if you didn't. Jesse Kayson was a much different story. Out of the family, he was kind of the star. He never showed up on any arrest records. He was, like I said, good-looking, charismatic, kind of talk his way into anything, including when he moved to Crestview, the cream of the crop as far as society goes. Pretty soon, Jesse Kayson, after he moved there, was finding himself running in circles that were the people that had founded the county. He was hanging out with the Maples. He was hanging out with the MacArthurs, the Steeles. The really important people in Okaloosa County, for some reason, were drawn to Jesse Kayson, or Jesse Kayson was drawn to them and was able to move his way into their circles in a pretty big way. Now, we have Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all these different ways to catch up on what our friends are doing. Back in the 1930s and 1940s, the way that you understood who was going where to what party or who was hanging out with who was a newspaper. And the newspaper would publish articles that were just society sheets. This party happened, these people were there. This gown was worn here. This marriage was here. And everything was very detailed. And thanks to that, I can kind of trace Jesse's rise through society in Okaloosa County from the time he moved here. And I think a lot of that begins in 1930, around the 4th of July, when a notice came out that there was a 4th of July party hosted by the Enzers, and he was there, and he was one of the main guests. It was hosted by Connie Enzer, and who else was there was Altie MacArthur, Melanie Maples, who he'd eventually marry, the Steeles, Johnny P. Steele's family, the sheriff in Okaloosa County. I can even tell you what they were served. Red, white, and blue brick ice cream with angel's food cake and fruit punch. It was also around this time that Jesse Kayson began dating or courting Consuela Enzer, Connie Enzer, who was the daughter of Dr. Olin Enzer, one of the guys that founded the Enzer Brothers Hospital, and arguably one of the richer, more powerful people in all of Okaloosa County. I know that by February of 1931, the two were dating, because they hosted a Valentine's Day party together that almost everyone in their circle attended. I've actually seen several pictures of Connie Enzer when she was in her early 20s, when she would have met Jesse Kayson. And she was beautiful. I don't know that I'm the best person to describe, a woman's looks, but she had really dark hair, dark eyes, and was really a looker. I can see why Jesse fell in love with her. Trying to get information about Jesse has been pretty difficult, personal information outside of what I do know. And one of the people I talked to in this whole process was Jimmy Whitaker. In the first episode, I talked with him and Jerry Milligan, who was the mayor of Crestview for a long time. They're both Crestview guys. They were born, raised there. And Jimmy actually was friends with Jesse Kayson. Here's what I got from Jimmy when I asked him about Jesse. Does either one of you remember a family, the Kaysons?
Yep.
What can you tell me about the Kaysons?
Well, they've been around here for years.
Yeah.
The Kayson family had. One of them ran a liquor store past Marcamp down there. Raymond, that was one brother.
Yeah.
Doyle was another brother. Mm-hmm. And Jess was another brother.
What about Jesse?
Jesse?
Yeah.
Likeable fella, good personality.
We knew him all as...
He may have did a little gambling. I don't know that for sure. I don't know what Jess did. He was just always here, popping up.
And
Neat and clean. He wasn't he didn't drink to the point that he was obnoxious to anybody or nothing like that either. He was behaved well.
Yeah, I tried to press Jimmy a little more on Jesse Kayson, and I could tell they were friends, and I can understand wanting to protect your friend's reputation or their interests, especially after they're dead. So that's the information I got from him. But what I did know is that Jesse kept this kind of upward arc through Okaloosa County society after he married Connie Enzer in June of 1931. It's kind of a weird announcement because they got married at home with only their immediate family there. They went on a 15-day honeymoon to the towns on the east coast of Florida and then took a cruise to Havana, Cuba from Key West. When they came home, they lived with the Enzers, and pretty quickly, Jesse's name started popping up a lot more in social circles, more than it had before. For work, Jesse was tied to a guy named Andrew Outlaw, who ran not only the Crestview Ice Company, but also the Crestview Beer Company and the Crestview Distilling Company. It ended up being one of his closer friends he ever had. And by 1934, Jesse was one of the founding members of the Okaloosa Club of Young Democrats, and that was alongside Murray MacArthur, Bob Sykes, Lloyd Powell, a relative of Charlie Powell, who was one of the guys that was shot by Lester Wilson in 1939, and several of the Steeles, including Jack Steele. And I think people look at Jesse as someone you could really have a good time with. Bob Sykes and William H. Maples, who founded Okaloosa County, those two turned to Jesse on several occasions to host, big events in Crestview. Early in 1936, Jesse was named chief of the birthday ball for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's birthday. For some reason, people celebrated the president's birthday individually then, and since it was, a very patriotic county, it was a big deal for Jesse. In 1937, he had some other big stuff happen. He was put in charge of the fireworks for the 22nd celebration of Okaloosa County, the anniversary, and that was a party that was headed by Bob Sykes and William H. Maples. And as you can see, fireworks might be a pretty important thing for them. It was also in 1937 that he experienced a little bit of tragedy. Andrew Outlaw, who I mentioned he worked with quite a bit and was his mentor, died that year. And he was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. And this is interesting to point out because Andrew Outlaw was a pretty influential guy in Crestview at the time. And his funeral really ties a lot of the people that we think may have been part of the conspiracy to kill Lester Wilson together. In fact, if you just look at the pallbearer list, we can see a lot of the people that we've mentioned so far. Obviously, Jesse Kayson was one of the pallbearers. So was Newman Bracken, a senator, and the guy who ran a drugstore downtown. Bob Sykes, who ran the local paper. Altie MacArthur, who would end up being sheriff one day and was the obviously older brother of Murray MacArthur. William H. Maples, and John P. Steele, the sheriff who Lester Wilson had so many problems with. It was also in the late 1930s that the marriage between Jesse and Connie started to fall apart. And Jesse had a pretty bad problem with alcohol, and he also cheated on her quite a bit. Now, I'm not totally certain when Connie and Jesse made their divorce official, but I do know that by 1940, because of census records, Jesse was remarried to a woman named Mamie, and they started having children together pretty quickly. It was also around this time that Jesse Kayson opened his own drugstore in the late 1930s. Now, I don't think it was very successful, and I think it was only open for a few years. And from what I've come to understand, the drugstore failed in part because of Jesse's pretty severe alcoholism that was, picking up steam, especially as his marriage fell apart, which happens to a lot of people, and also a burgeoning morphine addiction, which was pretty hard to keep under control. I do know that Connie remarried several times, at least 3 more times. I know in 1943, she married a guy in St. Louis. And in 1945, she came back home and her parents ran an announcement when she married a soldier from Eglin Air Force Base. I know that she had a 4th last name at one point too, Hilton. And I also know that Connie was pretty rich. That when Dr. Olin Enzer died, he left her a sizable fortune. At one point, she owned over 40 acres on Navarre Beach. That's property today that's worth in the tens of millions. I also know that Jesse struggled after that marriage fell apart. Now, while he may have been looked at as one of the boys and part of the circle, that money from the Enzer family was cut off after they broke up, and he got pretty desperate. I know that he was a produce vendor, like Doyle was, listed on the census, and they didn't make a lot of money off that. I know that he got work wherever he could, actually. And I found one interesting tidbit about Jesse that I thought really stuck out to me in this whole process. And that was that in May of 1940, in the Democratic primaries in Okaloosa County, Jesse ran unopposed for Justice of the Peace in the 3rd District in Okaloosa County. That's Crestview. And running unopposed, of course, he won. Now, what a Justice of the Peace does is they oversee a court that looks over, like, traffic tickets or minor infractions. Jesse would have been the guy in town that they looked to settle, like, landlord-tenant disputes and stuff like that. It's really kind of a know-nothing position. You don't have to have any sort of legal degree. You don't have to have any sort of college degree. You just have to know someone, essentially. And sometimes knowing someone is the most important thing. But to be really clear, what happened here is Jesse Kayson, 2 months after Lester Wilson was murdered, was put into a public office by the powers that be, which is pretty telling. It wouldn't last long. By 1943, Jesse Kayson had been committed to Chattahoochee State Hospital to deal with a pretty severe alcohol and morphine addiction. It was so bad that he would sweat through his sheets at night. It really scared his parents, and I think it scared a lot of people that he was friends with, especially when he was on drugs and he was drunk. Some of the things he'd talk about were secrets, and they didn't like that. So he was committed to Chattahoochee by Dr. Olin Enzer, who sent one of his hospital's ambulances to take him directly from his home in Crestview to the hospital. I believe he was there for about 3 weeks. And when he came back, he was asked to resign from his office as Justice of the Peace. And Governor Spessard Lindsay Holland put William H. Maples, who was a former state senator and judge, and obviously the guy that founded Okaloosa County, he named him Justice of the Peace after Kayson resigned. So what we've seen here is essentially the decline of this family over about 30 years. Starting in the mid-1920s when they moved to Crestview with a lot of hope. And it's kind of like Hawthorne said, things didn't pan out. Ultimately, the family began to get on that kind of low, long, downward slide toward kind of nothing. I know that by the 1950s, Jesse kind of settled into a routine. He owned a liquor store in town, and that did okay, but he was not part of society anymore. He was kind of on the outside. He was someone that just had lived there for a long time and ran a store that was okay, but he had no impact. It was around the same time also that, Raymond was running into pretty bad alcohol problems of his own, as we've discussed, and Doyle was in a long, slow slide himself. He was a produce vendor on the census. That's what he said he was. He didn't make any money. I mean, these guys were living in almost poverty at this point. They were kind of all destined to fade away, just to go into anonymity, to be this family that had a brief flash of hope, and then it disappeared. And that was until July 11th of 1958. You're listening to The Sheriff, a new podcast from the Gannett Company and the Northwest Florida Daily News. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you might download your podcast from. On the night of July 11th, 1958, 3 officers from the Florida Sheriff's Bureau executed arrest warrants for Jesse and Doyle Kayson on the charges of murdering Lester Wilson. The arrest warrants had been issued by Circuit Judge Irwin Fleet, working out of Crestview. The men were taken to jail in Panama City Beach and held. Jesse was 56 and Doyle was 51. Within 24 hours, another man was arrested in the murder. William Doris Brown, 49 years old, also of Crestview, and a civilian Air Force Base employee at Eglin Air Force Base. By the next morning, the arrests had hit the national newswire. People all over the country now knew the names of Jesse Kayson, Doyle Kayson, and William Doris Brown. It would kick off one of the more sensational trials in Florida history. On the next episode of The Sheriff.
Well, I do remember that I was under protective custody during the trial.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. I'm like 4 or 5 years old, yeah.
But I was under protective custody. I was hidden out in Orlando.
Really?
Yeah.
Was it you?
Because there was a threat. Dad told me years later the reason we sent you down there during the whole trial is because we had received that there might be threats on the family.
The Sheriff is recorded at the Northwest Florida Daily News in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. It's written and researched by Tony Adame and produced and edited by Nick Tomachek. Additional voice work on this episode was provided by Savannah Evanoff.